About 2,600 years ago, roughly, there was a man called Jeremiah. He wrote what I think is probably the saddest poem that I've ever read. Man was a prophet to Judah, a nation that at that period of time was losing its way. There were all kinds of problems that slowly crept in. They became successful, got wealthy, then greedy. They began to change their value system. Things began to fall apart, but they really couldn't see it. And so they evolved to a point where eventually their morals were gone, their marriages were failing, the young people were becoming rebellious, the synagogues were empty, and the people had forgotten God. And from that, it just went downhill further and further. Jeremiah was what we call a prophet. God sent him to warn the people that they needed to get back to their foundations. They needed to change their direction or there would be problems. Nobody listened. So one day, the Babylonians came into the land, and after besieging the city of Jerusalem, they destroyed the nation of Judah. It was dismembered piece by piece. The city walls were knocked down. The temple was likewise destroyed. Homes were burnt. People were rounded up. There were people who were slaughtered. Others were enslaved and deported out of the land back to the city of Babylon. All that was left were ruins and bodies on the streets, ashes, and the poorest of the poor, people who really had no way of pulling themselves together. And Jeremiah, the prophet, was there. He saw it all. He warned them it could happen, and it did. And then he looked at what was left over, and he wrote this book in the Bible that's called Lamentations. And just as it sounds, it's full of lamenting. It opens with these words, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people." How lonely sits the city that was full of people. It sounds like something that I've been witnessing lately. Empty city streets, buildings shut down, stores closed, and nobody seems to be there anymore. One evening back about a month or so ago, my wife and I took a drive into downtown Halifax. It was 5 o'clock in the evening, rush time. Normally it's bumper to bumper, and I've driven 4 or 5 blocks. It took me half an hour to do it. I was so impressed with the emptiness of it all that I took pictures. We saw 2 or 3 cars the entire time we were there. Empty streets, no one parked, no one on the sidewalks. The stores were closed. We drove through and around freely and saw nothing. How lonely it was and how empty it was. That's a sad, sad condition. And it's one that we've been struggling with for the last little while. The pandemic has hit us in a very rough way. And so we have a loneliness and an emptiness, and we want to know, what do we do now? Well, Jeremiah goes on in his poem to describe his personal state. And it sounds again like things I felt. Maybe you have felt as well. He says in chapter 3 of that book, "I'm the man who has seen affliction." He goes on to describe himself as the one that God has driven and made me walk in darkness and not in light. He complains about his skin, how it's wasting away. He feels, he says, besieged and encompassed with bitterness and hardship. He says, God has walled me in, so I cannot go out. That sort of sounds like where we're at. If you felt walled in, you can't go out, you can't do anything. He says, even when I cry out and call for help, it seems that God shuts out my prayer. Where is God? He's turned aside my ways, he says. He's torn me to pieces. And as he comes to the end of this particular complaint, he says, my soul has been rejected from peace. I've forgotten happiness. My strength has perished, and so has my health and my hope from the Lord. He lost hope. And as he felt that, it got deep into his soul. When you feel hopeless instead of hopeful, it's not good. Those who counsel others say that when the person has no hope, there's very little you can do to help them. You can try to talk it into being. You can try to work it up. You can try to make it come. But hope is not just an expectation, not just a feeling. It's not just a wish that things may come. True hope, if you analyze the term, has got to be fixed on something that's both ultimate and absolute. You need to know something for sure, because hope is not a wish. Hope is knowing, a certainty. For instance, we talk about our hope as Christians after death, that we shall live again and that we shall be raised from the dead. That's not merely a promise of God, and that's not just a religious feeling. That is something guaranteed by the historical evidence that Jesus Christ died and rose again from the dead, ascended to heaven, is coming back, and he will make us alive again. There's something absolute and ultimate about that. That's a hope, and is based on something we know and have absolute confidence in. Jeremiah came to a point where he had to get his hope back. How did he do it? Well, I read in this same chapter, he says, "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope." He went back to his foundations. He went back to the things that used to be so he could see what will come to be. And when he did that, he said, "This is what I remember, and it gives me hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses never cease." Think of loving kindness. It's not a word we use today. We use the word perhaps mercies, but I like the old term. You see, God is kind, but it's based on his love. And Jeremiah said, as I looked back and thought about it, the kind acts of God given in his love never cease. In other words, God never gives up. He doesn't pack his bags and leave. And then he said this as well. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. I think of loving kindness as action, but compassion is emotion, and is made up of the compound word of passion, which is deep feeling, with compassion, which means to do it together. God joins you and I where we're at in how we feel, in our depressions, in our tensions, in our anxiety. God never ceases to have compassion. He knows what you're going through, and he cares. And then the third thing that Jeremiah says is, "Great is your faithfulness." The faithfulness of God never diminishes. God is always there. You can count on him. It doesn't matter how bad things are. It doesn't matter how deep you descend. It doesn't matter how hopeless you feel it is. God brings hope. And it comes from his loving kindness, his compassions, and his faithfulness to you that never pass away, never cease, and never diminish. And when you read this in his poem, he then says this, "The Lord is my portion, therefore I have hope in him." He got his hope back because he looked to God, because he pegged it on someone who was certain and on something that would be done by God himself. One last thought. Jeremiah says this is how we find God in the midst of darkness, depression, and the gloom of all that is around us. He says, "The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him." Sometimes we need to wait and look. And he adds this to it. It is good that that person waits silently for the salvation of God. When we get all worked up and we get rushing around, we get full of tension, and we just sit down in the darkness, then we get hopeless. To get hope back and be full of hope is when we wait for God, we look for God, and we're quiet while we do it. You won't hear God whispering while you're talking, and you won't see the light in the darkness when your eyes are closed. Be quiet and know that he is God.